I hope you all are having a wonderful day. My name is Yupari and I'd like to invite you into this oil painting demonstration. And in this portrait painting video, I think I'm going to go ahead and create another Zorn Palette video. I know I've used the Zorn Palette so many times, but it really is my favorite color arrangement for portraiture. So we're going to change things up a little bit. So instead of lead white, I'm using titanium white. This is cadmium red medium, yellow ochre, and ivory black. So the only difference with this Zorn palette and my previous one is that before I used lead white, but now we're going to just be using titanium white. So to get started, I'm going to just get a palette knife and I'm going to mix myself up a drawing color. So for the past few videos, I've been starting off with charcoal, and that's a pretty useful way to start. But I think with this painting, I don't know, I just feel like starting off with a burnt umber style drawing. Now, burnt umber is, if you haven't used burnt umber before, it's just a simple dark brown color. And so since we don't have that on the Zorn palette, I'm just mixing up with the palette knife the cadmium red medium and the ivory black in about equal parts, I'd say. So I think that's all right. Pretty good mixture to start off with. The reason I'm using the palette knife is just because I can pick up much more paint and mix much more rapidly. Just want to get a nice, simple, uniform mixture of ivory black to cadmium red. Now, the next thing I'm going to do is get my drawing brush, and if you want to know exactly what materials I'm using, you can go ahead and scroll down to the description box below, and I'll have all that information typed up for you. So with my drawing brush, I'm just going to apply a little bit of odorless mineral spirits to it, tiniest bit, just to get the paint to flow a little bit, and only a little bit. This is probably just about 2% mineral spirits to 98% paint. So first thing I want to do is establish the top of the head, and with a single mark, I think I'm going to just establish it right there. And let's see, let's look at the bottom of the head now. So let's suppose that I want the bottom of the head, I'd say, to be roughly about there. So now we kind of have our little working parameter. Now let's look at the corners of the canvas. So I'm thinking I want the edge of the head, one side to be here, other side, I don't know, maybe about there. So we're going to look at this in kind of a order of steps. So this is going to be my first step, and this is the composition and placement. So we're going to look at 5 steps to creating a portrait painting using the Zorn palette. So the first order of business, is to find your composition and placement. And this is really something you can establish just like that with a few simple straight lines and angles. We already have an idea of where the head is going to go, where the shoulders are going to fall, and you know what, let's go ahead and put in a little shape for the collar. So I'm going to suppose that the collar is going to fit about there. Okay, so now that we have the general composition, we now want to move into the next stage. So we're going to move into the gesture stage. So the gesture is really, all it means is we're going to figure out exactly what the head is doing. Gesture is all about movement. So this is going to be the center line of the head. Now the center line is going to tell me what the head is doing in space. So right now it looks centered, but on the image that you're looking at, the portrait is actually turned 3/4 relative to us. So let's put a little mark in there for the ear, for one ear, and a little mark in for this ear. So as you notice in the image, we're seeing much more of this ear than this ear. So that's kind of a telltale sign that the head is turned 3/4 relative to us. So we're actually seeing more of this side of the face, more of this side than we're seeing of that side. So now that we have our center line and some little loose shapes for the ears, let's go ahead and place the smaller shapes for the portrait. So let's go ahead and follow this line down here towards the mandible. So the mandible is at somewhat of a distance, somewhat of an angle like this. Another little angle for the neck there. Now then, let's create a little axis mark here connecting basically the axis for the eyebrows, and we're actually relating it to the ear. And the trick here with the gesture is to basically get the portrait started. This is the time where you just go in there very fearlessly, apply a brave brush, and kind of establish your first guesses as to where everything is going to fit. So now we have the axis of the eyes, the axis of the eyebrows, axis of the eyes. Here we're going to have a simple shape for the hairline. Simple shape for the hairline. And here's the bottom of the nose. And that's how you're going to want to start it, with just a simple mark. Now we're going to have the bottom of the mouth, right about there. And we're going to go ahead and put in an accent mark for the corner of the eye socket. Corner of the eye socket goes right about there. And we're going to put in a little accent mark for the nose. Simple little accent mark. So the trick with the gesture is to get the overall movement of the pose by indicating where the features are going to be placed. So this is the time where you're trying to figure out what the model is doing in space, not who the model is. Don't think about who the model is, just think about what the model is doing in space. And just using these simple straight lines and angles, we're going to be able to basically adjust all of this information and mold it into the next stage. And the next stage of the portrait is going to be the block in. Now, the task in the gesture, as we're still working on the gesture right now, the task is to set us up for the block in. So keep your shapes simple and easy for you to understand, so that when the time comes to make the changes, which we certainly will, the changes will be simple and easy to understand. So now that we have all of the elements in there, just using our eye, we're going to go in and refine these elements. So pretty much like a puzzle, like a jigsaw puzzle, depending on how you like to solve your jigsaw puzzles, the tactic that we're going to use here is to just get our pieces on the table. So this is essentially us getting all the pieces on the table. That's all this is. And now what we're going to do is arrange the shapes in such a way that the shapes are reminiscent of what we're observing in nature. So now my first observation is going to be that if this is going to be the location of the axis of the eyebrows, I better be sure to relate this distance, so this distance here for the eyebrows, I better be sure to relate that to the bottom of the chin. So what I mean is this distance here, I better be sure that the distance from here to here is in relation to the distance from the top of the head to the eyebrows. Now you can do this with the eyes as well. And in fact, let's go ahead and look at that for the eyes first. So the eyes, typically with the model facing you forward, like the model is doing here, this distance here is equal to this distance roughly, which it is on our portrait. But I'm using the eyebrows just because I think that the eyebrows kind of adds a bit of character. Doesn't always have to be this way, but let's look at this distance here. So clearly we have much more distance from the eyebrows to the chin than the top of the head to the eyebrows, which is actually very similar to what we're observing on the model. So now then, the nose and the mouth are going to be kind of moved around in relation to this shape here, the eyebrows to the eyes. So let's go ahead now and move on to the next stage, which is going to be the block-in. So in the block-in, we're going to be working with simple shapes of light and dark, and always making the shapes much more specific as we go. Remember, the task is not to copy the image in front of you. Now, if you want to copy it, that's perfectly fine. You can break out a little bit of tracing paper, some rulers maybe, and just, copy the outlines if that's what you want to do. But this is an interpretive process where we're taking the visual information that we're being presented with and making our own marks and our own decisions based on our own interpretation of the model. So now what we have right here is a very strong angle for the zygomatic region of the portrait. So that is the cheekbone. Here we have just a simple little rectangular shape for the side of the nose, just simple shapes of light and dark. Now, nothing is set in stone. Again, this is very similar to the gesture where we're just getting our shapes, kind of just putting our puzzle pieces on the table. Same thing is said for the block-in. So this is the block-in phase now, when we're putting in just the simple shapes of light and dark. Let's go ahead and just kind of mush that shape in there for the top of the head. Doesn't have to be pretty at this stage. Don't worry about the aesthetics. Think about this as the where does stuff fit phase. And that's all. Just think about it like that. So what are we going to do about the facial hair? So I'm going to squint my eyes, and when I squint my eyes, this is all just one dark shape. Squinting your eyes really does help you see things a little bit more simply. So here we have, now it's starting to look really funny, and that's okay. I mean, we're starting out with something. So let's go ahead and put in this shape here. So now I'm looking at this whole shape, and I'm thinking to myself, what does this shape look like? If I'm thinking of just an abstract shape, what does it look like? It looks like some type of triangle that goes all the way down here. So this is the triangle, but it kind of tapers off in this direction. It's very useful to try and abstract what you're looking at. So there's an angle here. And again, think about the shapes themselves. Don't worry about who the model may be or anything like that. Just think about shape. I'm going to apply just a tiny bit more mineral spirits to the brush because it's starting to dry out. So let's look at the shape of the ear again. So again, if this is the eyebrow, let's run a horizontal. This goes right out to here. And again, we're still in the block-in phase where we're just blocking in the simple patterns of light and dark. Now let's look at the corner. Now optically, there's much, I noticed that this is much taller than it is wide. So I have to pay attention to that. Now the ear, let's see. So this is where the nose might fit. The ear is going to go right about there. Now the marks do appear a little bit darker, but that's just because of the mineral spirits. And it's going to sink in. So meaning that the mineral spirits are going to evaporate in the air, and then this will eventually kind of become this value. That's why your teachers or your professors tell you usually to, if you're using mineral spirits, have a window nearby because it does evaporate into the air. So let's just look at this shape here. Now optically, the shape is a little smaller. So let's just paint it how we see it. So I'm just looking at the abstract. And don't worry, this is all going to kind of evaporate. Now that I see that I need a little bit more specificity into the shapes down here. So let's go ahead and push this down. Somewhat like that. This is going to kind of angle in this direction. Just like that. I'm not worried about the features at all. I'm just looking at these large, simplified shapes. Zygomatic bone coming down here. Mandible. And it tapers in like that. Now with a little piece of paper towel, I'm gonna just fuzz that out. So this is gonna be kind of a game of, I can't speak today again. This is gonna be a game of back and forth. So we're gonna just go back and forth, place in a shape, stand back, sit back, see if it's correct. If it isn't, just adjust it and keep moving on in that kind of fashion. So the composition or the placement, as you notice, doesn't really take as long if we're painting a standard portrait like this, and neither does the gesture. But when it really starts to take a while is with the block in. And spend as much time as you possibly can with the block in, just observing simple shapes. That's why I usually recommend to my students to spend a lot of time just drawing. Just drawing. Just think about portrait painting as portrait drawing. Always think of it as a drawing. You're just drawing with paint. And that's all it is. This is the point in the block in where we start to draw in some of the light and dark shapes for the features. Now this is a very good example of kind of a checkpoint. So as we progress forward and start to add in more shapes, if anything goes wrong, we can always go back to this stage of the block in. So what I have here is a size 2 filbert bristle brush. It's a fairly used up brush, and I'm going to use this as my subtractive brush. So what I'm going to do is just subtract a little bit of paint from this side. So this is why I recommend to practice portrait drawing, and some of you may have noticed that I've been uploading more portrait drawing videos, particularly charcoal portrait drawing videos on Tuesdays. So I'm going to try to keep that going because that process is exactly what we're doing here, except with charcoal. That is the process that we use in the charcoal portrait drawing videos is the same exact process as what we're doing here. The only difference is I'm using just a dry, pretty used up bristle brush instead of the chamois cloth that I use in the drawing videos. So what I'm doing is just subtracting a little bit, and I'm just carving away. Now I want the features to fit within the overall large structure of the portrait. Now remember, we were just focusing on the simple block-ins, so simple straight lines and angles. There is no complexity here. This is basically the little triangle that you saw. This is just a single brush stroke for the nose. The mouth is just a blob right now, but it's a very organized mess, so to speak. Very few simple lines, and this is really the part of the painting where things start to take form. So if you've ever wondered at what point in the painting will the image start to emerge, it's really in this stage of the block-in. So here's the little shape here for the upper eyelid. Now I'm trying to avoid adding in too many details too quickly. And think about details like, I forget, one artist used to say, think about details as the spots on an apple. Think about the features as the spots on an apple. Oh goodness, who said that quote? I believe it was Mr. John Singer Sargent, one of our favorite portrait artists of all time, that was quoted by saying, think about the features as spots on an apple. This is the overall shape of the apple. Much harder. It's much harder to figure out these large shapes than it is to draw these little shapes for the features. Now for the features, I'm sure you're curious. So it's 1, 2, 3. Basically 3 marks out here and then the iris. Now I know there's a little bit of light showing here, but I'm ignoring that for now. Very simple here. Dark shape here. Now the trick is simple and easy. Just keep your shapes simple for you to understand. Now I'm thinking of the characteristics of the model, so I'm thinking of the distance between the eyebrow to the eye. Now it's a little bit smaller with this model, so meaning the eyebrows are much closer to the eye than I'm used to. So that's one way you can think about the characteristics of the model. So I'm actually going to go ahead and push this up. And again, this is just a size 2 filbert bristle brush, but this brush is, you can see it's pretty much at the end of its life. So usually when my bristle brushes retire, they start to move into the subtractive brush, kind of subtractive brush utility. So let's even subtract a little bit of light here. And now, simple shapes of light and dark are very deceptive because they look very simple. But that's really where all the work is in terms of figuring out where things fit. And I could spend all day on just a simple block-in, especially if I'm working on a commission portrait or something, or I'm working with graphite, that is a graphite pencil, then I'll spend much longer on the block-in. Now let's take a look at the bottom of the nose. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to sit back. I see that perhaps, I think the nose might be too long. I'm not sure. So if the shape of the mouth is here, so this is how I problem solve. Think about drawing as problem solving. I think the nose is too long. So if it is, I'm just going to go ahead and just test it out. Test out just pushing this shape up a little bit. You'd be surprised at how the tiniest little changes can make all the difference in a portrait. So moving that shape up a little bit. Let's move it up even more. And subtract a little bit here. I think that's about where I want it to be. It's actually, I've got a different brush. So I'm going to just get a size 0 round. So what I'm going to do is pick up a little bit of paint from the shadow here. And I'm going to go ahead and just add it to the bottom of the eye. Just to get the bottom eyelid. Thinking of this large structure. I've heard some folks refer to this technique as open grisaille. Please correct me if I'm wrong, which I might be. But grisaille, of course, as we all know it, is just painting with one color. Basically, you could use burnt umber, titanium white, or you could use raw umber or whichever color you'd like. And it's a grisaille is basically an underpainting. But what this is we're leaving the lights open. So I believe that's why it's called open grisaille. But regardless of what the name is, the tone of the canvas, if you're wondering, is just burnt umber oil paint that I diluted with mineral spirits and just toned the surface with several weeks ago. So what I'm doing with this brush is just establishing now some of the boundaries between light and shadow, meaning the halftones, the dark lights. So the dark lights you can see over here is the halftone just as light terminates into shadow. And it's going to be pretty important for me to know where those shapes fit, excuse me, where those shapes fit when we move into the next phase of this process. So now with the mouth, simple little dark shape there. Now let's go ahead and subtract a little bit right around here. So with the mouth, I usually like to think about the nose. So the corner of the nose, I'll draw a plumb line, meaning a vertical line all the way down right here, and see where it meets the mouth. So it meets kind of the bottom lip here, but then there's a little bit to the left still that can be described. Just a little shape there. And of course we have this dark shape here. So again, think about this 5-step process. So first we started out with the composition, the placement, just the placement of the head. We moved on to the gesture where we were figuring out where the features were to fit. This is the block in. So now I'm pretty sure that the block in is all right to move into the next stage. So the next stage is going to be I'm going to call it the 3-tone color mass. 3-tone color mass, meaning I'm going to fill in a color for the light, the shadow, and the dark light. So let's go ahead. I'm using a size 4 filbert bristle brush, and I'm going to mix up kind of the first flesh tone. We can refer to it as a false color if you'd like. It's pretty much going to be the foundation. So it's going to be kind of like the posterized image of the portrait. So again, just using titanium white, yellow ochre, and cadmium red medium. And I'm not using that much titanium white because again, titanium white is a very opaque white. So just getting a nice little mixture between these 3 colors. Let's see what it looks like there. And it's way too pink. So I'm going to go ahead and take a little bit of the ivory black, just a tiny bit. Might have just messed it up, but we'll see. I just put in a tiny touch of the ivory black. Let's try it out again. And that looks about acceptable for my first flesh tone pass. So let's go ahead and fill in the rest of this shape now. As I'm filling in this shape, I'm also kind of applying more pressure. See here? I'm applying a little more pressure where the portrait is lighter, and a little less pressure over here where the portrait is darker. So let's go ahead. This shape comes all the way out here. All the way out there. I'm going to use my fan brush to just eliminate some glare. Now this is going to be, again, I'm referring to this stage of the painting as the 3-tone color mass. So 3-tone color masses. So light, shadow, and dark light. But right now we're just focusing on the light. And I'm not using any mineral spirits, none whatsoever. And the reason I'm not using any mineral spirits is that we're going to be completing this painting alla prima style, meaning it's going to be done all in one sitting. But the difference between this technique and the technique that you saw last week and the week before that is that we're really focusing on the block in, and we're trying to lock everything into place with the block in. Whereas before we were treating it kind of like a sculpture, now we're just kind of thinking two-dimensionally. But don't worry, the three-dimensional thinking will come into play. A little bit of light in here. So I'm kind of editing where I put in the tone. If you notice, I'm still leaving this light, or this area, just being the tone of the canvas. Now what I'm going to do with this small little round brush, I'm going to mix the white, the ivory black, a little bit of flesh tone, just a little smidgen of flesh tone. And now I'm going to put in the light for the sclera. So kind of just misled you. I said I would have the light, the dark light, and the shadow, but we are going to put in a little bit of light for the sclera. So I'm going to just consider this light for the sclera to be, I'm going to group the light for the sclera in with the flesh tone. And this is all the same step. And if at any point anything goes wrong, you can always go back to the block in. And the way you would do that is just with a little bit of paper towel, just start to unify everything, just kind of smudge everything together. So we're filling in these lights, a little bit of light here, a bit of light over here. Now with the sclera, the trick with the sclera is to know that it's not straight white. Notice we mixed it with the ivory black, and here my paint's starting to fall down. Remember, we mixed it with the ivory black and a little bit of the flesh tone. Going back in with the drawing color, put this dark shape back in. Now I'm going to go ahead and mix up the shadow color. So I'm going to use a different brush for that. I'm using ivory black, very similar to the drawing color. Ivory black and cadmium red medium, a little bit of yellow ochre this time. Okay, so one little tip with the Zorn palette is that all four of these colors are pretty slow drying, especially the ivory black and the cadmium red. So that's one thing to keep in mind, is that this palette will allow you to work much longer than if you were using faster drying colors such as lead white, flake white, or burnt umber. So let's see, this value is pretty dark, and that shadow is pretty dark. So let's see what this looks like. I think this will work. So I'm actually letting some of the drawing color influence the shadow, and that's quite all right. So now we're just filling in this dark shape. You know, I think there needs to be a little bit more warmth, so I just throw in a little bit of cadmium red. Now, if you saw last week's portrait painting video, I also used only 4 colors, but I used, instead of cadmium red, I used Venetian red, and I really liked that setup. Now I went ahead and started talking about the previous video, but the difference between the cadmium red medium and the Venetian red, in case you're wondering, that I've started noticing just now actually, is that the Venetian red was raising the value of my ivory black a little bit too fast, whereas the cadmium red medium, what we're using right now, doesn't raise the value so dramatically. But it's not a problem. You just have to modulate how much paint you use. And let's look at the shape here now. This actually has to be a little bit bigger to get his characteristic, the concavity of his eye socket. And that looks about all right. Now the next thing I'll do is with a different brush, I'm going to start to put in the dark light. So I'm going to use just cadmium red, yellow ochre. So the halftone right about here is a little bit warmer. So conceptually, we should be seeing a little bit more of the local flesh color in the halftones. And that's because there's less influence of the light. Remember, the color of the light kind of influences things. So what I'm doing is I'm creating a similar mixture to the flesh tone and the light, but I'm making it warmer and darker. Let's actually take some of the drawing color, a little bit more cadmium red, and we're going to use this and compare it on the palette to the color that we have. So we're just comparing them to one another on the palette. So let's see how they fit together. Letting them touch on the palette. I think that's a pretty good value to put in for the dark light now. So let's go ahead and put that tone into place. So let's look at the cheekbone. Cheekbone is coming out right about here and then wraps in towards the eye socket there. And I'm not too worried about the edge quality just yet. I can always come back in and soften the shapes where I want to. So the reason I'm going in with the dark light at this stage, remember this is the band of the dark light, kind of distinguishing the edge between light and shadow. So the reason I'm going in with the dark light is because the next stage after this is going to be selective rendering. So we're going to go right into our full value scale and selectively render the areas that we want to look more realistic. So there's even a little dark light right about here. Very simple there. Now the dark light is the most important light, the most important tone in the light in order to describe the curvature of the surface that you're trying to paint. So what this dark light is telling me is that the light is going in this direction pretty flat and then whoa, starts to turn and then goes right into shadow. So now we're switching into three-dimensional thinking. And again, let's put in that dark light right about here. Right over here. This is a very classical way of looking at the arrangement of tone, the arrangement of value. Even down here, it's a little glimpse of dark light. And of course, right over here. But right over here, we're seeing much less of the warmth of the flesh tone. I'm talking about this area. So we're seeing much less of the warmth of the flesh tone. So we're going to leave that be the kind of gray of the background or burnt umber color of the background tone of the canvas. Let's see, another dark light. I believe this is a shadow, I think. Not sure actually. This area here is kind of in question, but it is nonetheless a little bit warmer and a little bit lighter than I had it. So let's just use this shape. Why not? All right, so now I'm going to take a look at this shape here. Still feel like there could be the indications of that dark light. Very simple. All right, so now we're going to go and selectively render certain areas. So this is going to be the last stage. So remember, first was composition and placement. So basically in the beginning, let's actually, as I tell you that I'm going to fill in this for the lips. So in the beginning, it was about figuring out where to place the portrait. So that was the placement. Then we moved into the gesture. The gesture was finding out the general movement of the pose. Then after the gesture came the block in, where we blocked in all of the shapes of light and shadow very simply. And even at this stage, it's very simple. Remember, the block in will take probably the most time to figure out where all your shapes of light and dark go. And think about your block in as kind of a checkpoint. So whenever anything goes wrong, we can always go right back into simple shapes of light and dark. Now, this is the fourth stage, meaning the three-tone color masses. So tone for the light, and remember, I'm grouping the sclera and the flesh tone. The half tone, which we're putting in now, so that is the dark light, and then the shadow, just 3 tones. And from here, we're going to move into selective rendering, and selective rendering should be the last thing that we'll need to make this portrait come to life. So before we get into selective rendering, we're going to want to have a new tool at our disposal. So here is the flesh tone brush. So this is the brush that I use for that. So what we're going to create is a value scale of flesh tones on our palette. And we're going to reference to these values as we mix. So we're going to keep mixing color, but we're going to try to maintain a specific tonality. Remember, the value, the word value just means how light or how dark something is. So right now we have 1, 2, 3. Now with the same brush, we're going to move on down, and this is going to be the mid-tone range of the palette. So the selective rendering stage can take quite a bit of time as well. So I'll tell you what, if you're working on a long-term portrait project, or you're working with an art group and have limited amounts of time per session, this is a good stage. This is a good stage to let it dry. But since we're working alla prima, we can paint and build right onto that, no problem. But just to let you know, this is a good stage to let it dry. Just let it sit and dry if you've run out of time by this point. What I'm using is a size 0 round brush. And again, if you want to know exactly what materials I'm using, you can go ahead and scroll down to the description box below, and I'll have all that information typed up for you. So right here, we're going to start to put in the shape for the lower eyelid. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at each section now, one piece at a time, and compare their local value and color to the surrounding areas. So that is this shape here for the bottom of the eyelid. It's a little bit darker than these areas surrounding the eye. But it gets even darker as we approach the tear duct. So again, using my value scale on the palette, we're going to walk our way on over to this corner here where it's going to start to get darker. And this is how we manage value. This is going to be the next level. This is going to be what takes your painting from that 2-dimensional stage to a 3-dimensional stage, is how you relate values to one another. So again, a little bit darker there. And now we have a little bit, so let's take some of the light here. A little bit of light right here. And one thing I would advise is be careful, because these features they have a tendency to grow. As we start to add emphasis into a particular shape, things can grow. So let's be careful not to grow the eye. But if it grows a little bit, that's okay. You can easily just squinch it back together. So taking from the darkest region of the palette. So it's going to be a little bit lighter near the bottom of the lower eyelid. A little bit lighter over there. I use a fan brush to eliminate some glare. Now I have pretty much a dedicated dark brush, a dedicated middle tone brush, and a dedicated light brush. So this is going to be my dark brush. And that color is no more complicated than ivory black, and pretty much just ivory black and cadmium red. Now going in with the middle tone brush with a little bit more cadmium red. Now with the light brush, it's going to be a little bit darker here actually, but still lighter than the lower eyelid. And now let's actually put in some indications of the edge quality. It's going to be a little bit softer here near the back of the eyebrow. Now with the lighter brush, let's go ahead and just move this shape down a little bit. Now with the dark brush, we're going to push this shape out. Now with the light brush, we're going to put in just titanium white and a little bit of yellow ochre. A little highlight right there. Now we're going to move on down the value scale of the palette. Put in the top plane, the lower eyelid. Very simple. A little bit more cadmium red to that mixture. And we have the top plane for the tear duct. I'm going to switch to the middle tone brush and a little bit of black and white mixed together with cadmium red. I'm going to adjust this shape a little bit. Let's go ahead and make this even darker now. Now we're starting to get even more definition into the shape. And let's push it. Let's make it even darker and more red. Even darker and more red. Now surrounding that shape, it's going to be even lighter. So just cadmium red, yellow ochre with a little bit more of the titanium white. It's going to be a little lighter here. Lighter and more pink. Now I'm going to add a little more yellow ochre. And put in this light here. And this is for the nasal bone. Very simple. Now I'm going to try to differentiate this plane from this plane. So using the middle tone brush, I'm going to combine the black and white and a little bit of yellow ochre and a smidgen of cadmium red. I'm going to try to make this plane much more solid now. Back in with the dark brush. So now switching to the light brush, we're going to try and redefine this edge here. It's a little bit lighter. Just trying to differentiate this plane from this plane. Now with a little bit more black and white, I'm going to bring down the chroma surrounding this shape here. It's a little bit more yellow ochre and titanium white. So yellow ochre, titanium white. Even more light down here now. And this is basically kind of the area of the maxilla surrounding the corner of the bottom of the eye. And let's add a little bit more yellow ochre and white, and a smidgen of cadmium red. So now the trick here really is to modulate the values such that the form starts to appear three-dimensional now. It's really all about these simple gradations of tone. Notice how it's lighter here, and then it's going to get progressively darker as we approach the tear duct. Taking a little bit from the mid-tone region of the palette. We have this shape here. A little bit more pink right around here. Remember, you can make pink very easily with just titanium white, cadmium red. A little bit more from the mid-range of the palette into here. Let's actually switch to the mid-tone brush. Back to the dark brush. Now let's go ahead and put in a little more information for the nose. So I'm in the mid-tone region of the palette, and I'm using a color that's a little similar to pink. Pink being just red and titanium white, so cadmium red and titanium white. But we have a tad bit of yellow ochre and black and white into this mixture, and we're just going to look at this large plane for now. And so there's a little bit of a side plane over here on the side of the nose, so a little bit more cadmium red and ivory black. And here we have this little shape here. Switching brushes now. I'm going to switch to my light brush, and we're going to put in this light shape here on the bottom of the nose. I'm going to switch to my dark brush. I'm going to use cadmium red and ivory black. Hopefully this will be dark and red enough. That seems to be about right. So I just want a very dark red for that shape. Now with the light brush, a little bit of titanium white, yellow ochre, and a pretty decent amount of cadmium red. We're going to go ahead and put this shape in here. Now the edge right here, this edge, is going to be fairly sharp, whereas this edge here, the division between the wing of the nose and the maxilla region of the face, is going to be much softer. So let's mix up a little more titanium white and cadmium red. And here we have this soft edge. And now we're going to go ahead and take a look at the shadow. So let's take the drawing brush that we had and just add the shadow color to it. Push this shape in. Very simple. Now I'm going to go into the halftone brush, mixing pretty much in the mid-tone region of the palette. We're going to have to put in this dark light and make it even more specific than we did earlier. So it's a little bit more of the cadmium red. This shape is actually going to push out a little bit more. Now we're going to add a little bit more of the cadmium red, yellow ochre. That's going to be just a little bit of light here. Very simple there. Now with the light brush, I'm going to go in with the titanium white and yellow ochre. Here we have our little highlight there for the nose. Now surrounding the highlight, there's going to be a pretty light area, so let's go ahead and try to paint that shape in there. And just soften the edge around it. Super simple. Now with the light brush, let's go ahead and add a little bit of cadmium red, titanium white, and only a tiny bit of titanium white. And add a little bit more color. We want a little more color here for the nose. A little bit more warmth there. Now with the halftone brush, we're going to move on down. Halftone right there. Now with the light brush, I'm going to go ahead and move this shape up a little bit, thus giving us the root of the nose. Now let's move on to the cheek. So let's look at the cheek to the right. So I'm going to use basically the middle tone region of the palette with my halftone brush. So this is pretty much just pink and a little bit of kind of a color similar to our drawing color. So we're going to continue with this tone all the way up here. Now remember, there's going to be quite a bit of warmth in this area. So I'm going to use a little more cadmium red and white in these mixtures. Very simple. Let's just go ahead and let these edges go a little soft. Now let's use a little more cadmium red to make a very nice and chromatic pink. And the pinkest light is probably there. Make it a little bit lighter, a little bit more chromatic. That's going to be just about the most pink that we're going to see on the portrait. So a little bit more black and white. We have a very neutral color here. Let's add a little bit of yellow ochre to it. Just a little bit of yellow ochre here. Now let's move on to the other cheek. So with a kind of a dark pink, I'm going to go ahead and just establish this boundary here. Now this is a very conceptual way of looking at the portrait. So this is the side plane of the face. So we're painting in a darker area towards the bottom. And it's not that easy to see on the photo reference, but what's happening is we're establishing a plane change here, here, and then down here towards the mandible. And now we're going to use just a little bit of titanium white and a little more cadmium red. So just titanium white, cadmium red. Let's go ahead and distribute this edge. So we're softening the edge a little bit. And this is going to give us the turn of the side of the face. Now it's very hard to see on the photo reference. There is quite a bit more light right here. So we're taking directly from the palette, the lightest area of the palette, And this is the peak of convexity of the cheekbone. So this is the area of the cheekbone that's sticking out the most. It's facing the light the most, rather. Just very easily just soften this edge as we move down. Now moving down to the mouth, I'm going to use a little bit of cadmium red, ivory black. We're going to go ahead and put in these red accents here. One accent here in this corner, on the other corner, and down here. Those are going to be our very dark darks. Now using the half-tone brush, I'm going to use just cadmium red, ivory black, and a little bit of gray. Gray is just white, black and white, just so I don't have a bright pink. We're going to go ahead and fill in the shape here. Just look at the shape. Don't worry about anything else, just the shape. Now we're going to move up the value scale. A little more titanium white and cadmium red. So a little more titanium white, cadmium red, and here we have this shape here. Now the trick is to not make it too saturated for the lips. Now the lips are pretty pink, and they are the pinkest shape, or sorry, the reddest shape on the portrait. Sorry, they're not pink, they're red, but I don't want it to be overly chromatic either. And that's just as more of an aesthetic decision that I'm making the lips not as red as they might appear on the computer screen. Switching to the dark brush, we're going to go ahead and reaffirm this shape here. And with the light brush, with a little bit of yellow ochre and titanium white, we're going to establish this little light shape here for the upper lip. Very simple. And again, with the cadmium red, titanium white, let's go ahead and just soften this little edge here now. Very simple. And back to the dark brush, a little bit of ivory black and cadmium red. Again, just re-establishing these shapes. Very simple. Now for the facial hair, just black and white and a little bit of our drawing color. Remember, our drawing color was just the red and the ivory black. We're going to go ahead and put in these soft little edges here for the facial hair. Very simple. Don't need much for the facial hair. Just need a soft edge and a dark value. Super simple. Now a little bit more ivory black. Just make sure this shape is well defined. Going to use the fan brush to eliminate some glare. Just go ahead and put some little brush marks here to indicate some of the facial hair. And a little bit of cadmium red and ivory black for this shape here. Let's go ahead even and push this shape a little darker. Now that I've selectively rendered some of these shapes on the portrait, I think I'm going to put at least a few little indications of light for the neck. So let's just take a large brush, just take right from the light region of the palette and put in this tone here. Not using any mineral spirits at all, really. What's allowing me to not have to use mineral spirits as much in my recent videos is that I'm working on a cotton canvas again that I toned with oil paint. So I toned it with burnt umber, sorry, excuse me, can't speak for some reason. I toned with burnt umber oil paint a couple weeks prior to filming, and it actually is a pretty slick surface that I've kind of grown used to. At first it took me a while to get used to it, but notice how I'm able to just, with a clean brush, just essentially just let the paint slide on the surface without much difficulty. So the shape that we have right here is this shape for the sternocleidomastoid, this little shape right here, the neck muscle. And around here, I'm going to choose to edit the image that I'm looking at. So I'm going to take from the dark region of the palette. So in the image that I have in front of me, I don't actually have the information for the bottom of the neck. So what I'm going to do is basically, with a few simple brush strokes like this, remember we're selectively rendering, just kind of suggest something here. See this? So it's not visible in the photo reference. And I'm sorry, it's just the way that I took the picture. I didn't really have the bottom of this available when I was zooming in to take the picture. But I'm going to just use that to my advantage to just kind of leave like a little unfinished area down here, kind of a vignette. Remember, if you've seen my videos before, you know the vignette is the area of the painting that you leave unfinished on purpose to complement the areas that are more finished. And one thing that I notice here that I don't really want is this line. So with paper towel, this is just dry paper towel, I'm just going to erase it. And this is how we're going to leave the shape for the vignette. And to finish up this painting, the last thing I'll do is just come back in with a clean and dry synthetic brush. This is a very, very soft brush. And just find some edges that I want to soften. And I think that this edge right here was just bothering me. So let's see. I think I'll soften some of these edges. Just a little light touch. Don't need much, especially around the corners of the mouth. I like to soften these edges as well. Just a little light touch, barely perceptible. Just softening these edges. And I think maybe a tiny bit over here. Tiny little light touch. And with that, that just about wraps up this portrait painting demonstration using those 5 steps, and as well using the Zorn palette. Now, to summarize the steps, remember, first we figured out our composition placement, so basically the placement of the head. Then we figured out the gesture, meaning we figured out the movement of the pose. Then we locked everything in with the block in. And then we applied the 3-tone color masses. And then we selectively rendered the areas that we wanted to pull into focus. And with that, we just about have the conclusion of this portrait painting demonstration. Again, I really hope that these videos are helping you out. I wish you the best in all of your artwork, and I'll see you on the next one.